I was 19 the night my father told me to leave the house and never come back. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene like in movies. Just a quiet dinner table, untouched food, and my mother staring at her plate as if it might save her from what was coming. My father's voice was calm, almost bored, which somehow made it worse. He said I was a liability, a bad investment, a son who didn't fit the future he had planned. I remember the clock ticking behind him, loud enough to feel like it was counting down the last seconds of my place in that family. I didn't beg, not because I was strong, but because something inside me shut down. I packed a small bag, took the little cash I had saved, and walked out into the cold night. No one followed me. No one called after me. When the door closed behind me, it felt final, like a coffin lid sealing shut. That was the moment I stopped being their son and became something else entirely, though I didn't yet know what. The first few years were brutal in ways I rarely talk about. I slept in places that didn't feel safe, worked jobs that barely paid enough to eat, and learned very quickly how invisible a person can become when they have no one backing them. Every failure felt like proof that my father had been right. Every small win felt temporary, fragile, like it could be taken away at any second. I learned not to trust comfort, because comfort had a way of disappearing without warning. What kept me going wasn't hope, at least not the kind people talk about. It was anger, quiet and controlled, sitting deep in my chest. Not the kind that makes you reckless, but the kind that sharpens your focus. I told myself I would never need them again. That one day, if the world ever turned upside down, I would be standing somewhere solid while they scrambled in the dark. At 19, that sounded like a fantasy. At 43, it became reality. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It never does. It started with small cracks people chose to ignore, businesses closing quietly, supply chains stalling, news anchors using words like temporary and unprecedented with forced smiles. I saw it coming years before most people did, not because I was smarter, but because I'd lived on the edge before. I knew what it looked like when systems failed and people pretended everything was fine. By the time the markets crashed and panic set in, I wasn't panicking. I had spent decades building quietly, deliberately, always assuming that no one was coming to save me. I invested in things people laughed at, land instead of status, skills instead of appearances, relationships built on trust, not convenience. While others were chasing comfort, I was preparing for instability, even if I couldn't fully explain why. When the government announced emergency measures and banks started freezing accounts, my phone finally started ringing. Old numbers, familiar names I hadn't heard in years. I let them ring at first. There was something almost poetic about the silence on my end after all that time. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I answered one call, then another, and with each conversation, the pattern became painfully clear. They were scared. My family, the same people who had written me off as a failure, were suddenly desperate. Their savings were locked. Their businesses were failing. The networks they relied on had evaporated overnight. And somehow they had heard whispers that I was doing fine. Not just surviving, but stable, secure, prepared. The irony was almost too much to process. My father called last. His voice was older, weaker, stripped of the authority I remembered. He didn't apologize, not really. He talked around it as if the past were an inconvenience rather than a wound. He asked questions disguised as concern. How was I managing? Where was I staying? Did I think things would get worse? And finally, carefully, he asked if I could help. That was the moment the power shifted, and he knew it. There was a pause after his question, long enough for both of us to understand what had changed. The man who once decided I was expendable was now asking for my protection. The son he cast out was suddenly holding something he needed. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do some of the talking for me. I told him I would think about it. Not yes, not no, just think. That word alone seemed to unsettle him more than outright rejection. Over the next few days, more messages came in. Relatives I barely remembered. Cousins who had watched me leave without a word. Everyone suddenly remembered I existed. Everyone suddenly believed in family again. I didn't rush my decision. The collapse was still unfolding, and I knew whatever choice I made would define the rest of my life. I wasn't interested in revenge, at least not the dramatic kind. I was interested in balance, in consequences, in deciding what kind of man I had become despite everything, not because of it. I arranged a meeting, neutral ground, a place I controlled. When they arrived, the fear in their eyes confirmed everything I already knew. These were not the people who had power anymore. These were people hoping someone else would take responsibility. When my father looked at me, really looked at me, I could see it sink in. I wasn't the 19-year-old boy with a bag in his hand anymore. I was the one with resources, with plans, with options. I laid out the rules calmly. No dramatics, no lectures. Help would not be unconditional. Trust would not be automatic. The past would not be erased just because the present was inconvenient. Some of them bristled at that. Others nodded too quickly, afraid to push back. My father said nothing, which told me more than any apology ever could. In that moment, I realized something important. Survival isn't just about resources, it's about boundaries, about deciding who gets access to your life and on what terms. At 19, I had no choice. At 43, I had all of them. And for the first time, the weight of that didn't feel like anger. It felt like clarity. I didn't save everyone. That's the part people don't like to hear. I helped those who were willing to accept responsibility, to acknowledge what they'd done, to rebuild rather than cling to entitlement. Others walked away angry, still convinced they were owed something. I let them go. The collapse taught a harsh lesson, but it was one I'd learned long ago. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that boy standing outside his family home with nowhere to go. I wish I could tell him that the pain wouldn't disappear, but it would mean something. That one day, the same world that rejected him would ask for his judgment. And that when that day came, he would finally understand his worth, not because others recognized it, but because he never gave up on it himself. Being disowned broke me once. Deciding who survived the collapse rebuilt me completely.